The shadow represents that portion of the personality which the ego has found unacceptable and has therefore relegated to the unconscious. It is not merely the repository of evil or destructive impulses, as is commonly misunderstood, but rather contains all those aspects of the psyche which contradict the conscious attitude and the persona we present to the world. The shadow carries not only our inferior qualities, but also our unrealized potentials, our primitive instincts, and those aspects of our nature which civilization has required us to suppress. I recall a particularly instructive case from my practice, a young academic of remarkable intellectual gifts who had read extensively in psychological literature and believed himself ready to undertake what he termed shadow integration. This gentleman, whom I shall call Herr K., approached me not seeking analysis, but rather confirmation of his self-directed psychological work. He had, through various exercises and practices gleaned from popular interpretations of analytical psychology, attempted to bring his shadow content directly into consciousness. The results were, as one might expect, catastrophic. Rather than achieving the integration he sought, Herr K. found himself possessed by precisely those forces he had sought to understand. His careful scholarly demeanor gave way to periods of inexplicable rage, followed by episodes of profound depression and self-loathing. He had opened the door he was unprepared to walk through, and the contents of his unconscious had overwhelmed his conscious capacity for assimilation. This case illustrates a fundamental truth about the nature of psychological development. The shadow exists as a necessary psychological function, serving as a repository for all that consciousness cannot accommodate. To approach it without proper preparation is akin to a medical student attempting surgery without having first studied anatomy. The intellectual understanding of psychological concepts bears little resemblance to the lived encounter with unconscious forces. The shadow compensates for the conscious attitude, maintaining psychological balance by holding all that the ego rejects. When we attempt to eliminate this natural psychological function through premature integration, we violate the fundamental structure of the psyche. The result is not wholeness, but fragmentation, not integration, but possession. The shadow phenomenon operates both individually and collectively, forming what I have termed the personal and collective shadow. On the personal level, it contains all those qualities, impulses, and potentials which the individual ego cannot acknowledge without threatening its carefully constructed sense of identity. The businessman who prides himself on rationality carries in his shadow the poet he never allowed himself to become. The devoted mother holds in darkness the autonomous woman who chose family over personal ambition. This personal shadow maintains an intimate relationship with the persona, that mask we wear in social situations. The more rigid and one-sided our persona becomes, the more powerful and potentially dangerous grows the shadow. The individual who presents himself as unfailingly kind and accommodating accumulates in his shadow a reservoir of unexpressed anger and resentment. The person who identifies completely with moral righteousness carries in darkness a capacity for transgression that can emerge with devastating force when the conscious attitude finally proves inadequate to life's demands. The collective shadow operates on a broader scale, containing all that a culture, nation, or group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. We have witnessed in recent decades the terrible manifestations of collective shadow projection, where entire peoples have attributed to their enemies all the darkness they could not face within themselves. The Germanic concept of the doppelganger speaks to this ancient understanding of our dual nature, as does the Christian recognition of evil as a force that must be acknowledged and resisted rather than denied. In my clinical work, I have observed how patients first encounter their shadow material. It typically appears initially through projection. The individual sees in others precisely those qualities he cannot tolerate in himself. The husband who accuses his wife of selfishness while remaining blind to his own narcissistic demands. The political reformer who attributes to his opponents the very corruption he practices unconsciously, the religious devotee who sees in others the doubt and rebellion that torment his own suppressed questioning. This projection serves a protective function, allowing the ego to maintain its cherished self-image while nevertheless maintaining some relationship, albeit an indirect one, with the shadow content. The projection creates a bridge between consciousness and the unconscious, even as it distorts our perception of external reality. When patients begin to withdraw these projections, often through the painful recognition that their strongest emotional reactions to others reveal something about themselves, they face their first genuine encounter with shadow material. This moment requires extraordinary delicacy in analytical work, for the ego's natural response is either to reject the emerging content entirely or to identify with it completely, both of which responses lead to psychological disturbance. The compensatory function of the unconscious ensures that shadow material will eventually demand recognition. The more completely we identify with our conscious attitude, the more insistently the unconscious presents us with its contrary perspective. This is not malicious interference, but rather the psyche's attempt to maintain balance and prevent the dangerous one-sidedness that leads to neurosis and, in extreme cases, to possession by unconscious forces. Individuation, which I have described as the central task of the second half of life, represents the process by which an individual becomes psychologically whole, not through eliminating the shadow, but through achieving a conscious relationship with all aspects of the personality. This process cannot be hurried, nor can it be accomplished through techniques or methods. Despite the modern tendency to seek psychological shortcuts, the individuation process requires, as its fundamental prerequisite, a strong and stable ego capable of maintaining consciousness while encountering unconscious material. The ego must be sufficiently developed to serve as a container for the powerful forces that emerge from the unconscious during genuine psychological development. Attempting individuation with an insufficiently developed ego is like trying to carry boiling water in a paper cup. The container cannot withstand the forces it is asked to hold. Modern life, with its emphasis on youth, novelty and rapid change, often encourages premature psychological exploration. Young people, sometimes barely past adolescence, seek to undertake the profound psychological work that properly belongs to the mature individual who has first established himself in life, career and relationship. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the natural sequence of psychological development. The alchemical tradition, which has provided me with invaluable symbolic understanding of psychological processes, describes the nigredo or blackening as the necessary first stage of transformation. This corresponds to the encounter with shadow material, a process that involves genuine suffering and disorientation, as the conscious attitude proves inadequate to emerging psychological realities. The alchemists understood that this dark night of the soul could not be bypassed or ameliorated through technique. It must be endured with patience and courage. I have observed in my practice that patients who attempt to circumvent this necessary suffering through premature intellectual understanding or spiritual bypassing inevitably find themselves confronted later with even more powerful manifestations of the same psychological material. The psyche does not allow us to cheat the process of genuine development. The difference between psychological inflation and genuine growth lies precisely in this relationship to suffering. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with archetypal material, when the individual believes himself to be the hero, the wise man, the prophet. This identification produces a temporary sense of expanded capacity and understanding, but it is built upon the ego's inflation rather than its genuine development. Such inflation inevitably leads to a compensatory deflation, often more severe than the original psychological state. Genuine psychological growth, by contrast, involves the ego's gradual expansion through conscious suffering and integration. The individual learns to hold increasingly complex psychological material without being overwhelmed by it or identifying with it completely. This process requires years, often decades, of careful work and cannot be accomplished through weekend workshops or intensive programs, however well-intentioned. The role of relationship in this process cannot be overstated. The individual cannot see his own shadow directly. It requires the mirror of relationship to reflect back those aspects of personality which consciousness cannot perceive. This is why genuine analytical work occurs within the context of the transference relationship, where unconscious material can be safely constellated and examined without overwhelming the patient's capacity for integration. The phenomenon of individual shadow work cannot be separated from our understanding of collective psychological processes. Just as individuals carry personal shadows, so do groups, nations, and cultures carry collective shadows containing all that the group identity cannot consciously acknowledge. The projection of this collective shadow onto other groups forms the psychological basis for much of the conflict and misunderstanding we observe in human affairs. During the recent war, I observed with growing alarm how entire populations could become possessed by collective shadow projections. Each side attributed to its enemies all the destructive and evil impulses that existed within its own collective psyche. The Germans saw in their enemies the very aggression and brutality they practiced. The Allies perceived in their opponents the barbarism and inhumanity that warfare inevitably evokes in all participants. This collective shadow projection serves the same protective function for groups that personal projection serves for individuals. It allows the group to maintain its cherished self-image while simultaneously expressing, through projected form, its own shadow content. The righteous nation, fighting for freedom, can express its own will to power by attributing power-seeking to its enemies. The peace-loving people can engage in warfare by projecting aggression onto those they fight. The danger of identifying too strongly with collective shadow content lies in the loss of individual moral responsibility. When we allow ourselves to be possessed by collective movements, whether political, religious, or social, we risk losing our capacity for individual ethical judgment. The individual becomes merely a vehicle for collective forces, acting out dynamics he does not understand and cannot control. I have witnessed in my practice how individuals who attempt shadow work without understanding these collective dimensions often find themselves overwhelmed by forces much larger than their personal psychology. The man who seeks to integrate his personal aggression may find himself channeling the collective shadow of his culture, becoming possessed by archetypal forces that far exceed his individual capacity for integration. The responsibility of the individual in relation to collective unconscious forces represents one of the most pressing moral questions of our time. As consciousness expands, as individuals become more aware of psychological processes, we bear an increasing responsibility not only for our personal development, but for our contribution to collective psychological health. The individual who integrates his shadow contributes to the collective integration of shadow content. The person who remains unconscious of his projections contributes to collective unconsciousness and the potential for mass possession. The role of the scapegoat in human societies illustrates this collective shadow dynamic with particular clarity. Groups require repositories for their collective shadow content, individuals or subgroups who can carry the burden of all that the collective cannot acknowledge about itself. The persecution of these scapegoats allows the group to maintain its moral self-image while expressing its shadow content through sanctioned violence. Understanding this dynamic places upon the conscious individual a profound moral obligation. We cannot simply withdraw our projections from personal relationships while remaining unconscious of our participation in collective shadow projection. The work of individuation necessarily involves taking responsibility for our contribution to collective psychological processes. The question naturally arises, how then shall genuine shadow work be undertaken? What constitutes proper psychological preparation for this most demanding aspect of human development? My years of analytical practice have taught me that there are no shortcuts, no techniques that can substitute for the slow, careful work of psychological maturation. The necessity of proper psychological preparation cannot be overstated. The individual must first establish a strong ego capable of maintaining consciousness under stress. This involves developing what I term ego strength through successfully navigating the challenges of external life, establishing oneself professionally, forming meaningful relationships, contributing to community, and developing the capacity for sustained effort and delayed gratification. Only when the ego has proven its capacity to function effectively in the world is it prepared to encounter the disorienting forces of the unconscious. The young person who has not yet established himself in life lacks the psychological foundation necessary for genuine shadow work. This is not a moral judgment, but a practical recognition of psychological reality. The role of the analyst in shadow confrontation involves far more than intellectual understanding or technical expertise. The analyst must serve as a container for the powerful effects and projections that emerge during genuine psychological work. This requires not only theoretical knowledge, but years of personal analysis and the development of what I call psychological carrying capacity, the ability to remain present and conscious while exposed to intense psychological material. The limitations of self-analysis in shadow work stem from the fundamental nature of shadow content. By definition, the shadow contains precisely those aspects of personality which consciousness cannot perceive directly. The individual attempting self-analysis faces the paradox of trying to see what he cannot see, to become conscious of what his consciousness necessarily excludes. While self-reflection certainly plays a role in psychological development, genuine shadow work requires the mirror of relationship to reflect back those aspects of personality which remain invisible to the individual himself. The moral implications of shadow integration deserve special attention. There exists a common misunderstanding that shadow work involves acting out previously repressed impulses or giving free rein to antisocial tendencies. This represents a fundamental confusion between integration and identification. To integrate shadow content means to become conscious of it, to accept it as part of oneself, and to take responsibility for it, not to be possessed by it or to act it out unconsciously. The integrated individual does not lose his capacity for moral judgment. Rather, he develops a more complete and nuanced understanding of the forces operating within himself and others. He recognizes his own capacity for both good and evil, his potential for both creation and destruction, and he chooses his actions from this position of enhanced awareness rather than from unconscious identification with either light or shadow. The gradual nature of genuine psychological development cannot be emphasized sufficiently. The psyche protects itself through its very resistance to change, allowing only as much unconscious material into consciousness as can be safely integrated. Attempts to force this process through intensive techniques or artificial methods violate the natural rhythm of psychological development and often result in psychological inflation or, in severe cases, in actual psychotic episodes. The importance of maintaining connection to collective values during individuation represents another crucial consideration. The individual who becomes too removed from collective standards and values risks losing his capacity for meaningful relationship with others. Individuation does not mean isolation or rejection of cultural norms. Rather, it involves achieving a conscious relationship with these collective values rather than unconscious identification with them. As I reflect upon the nature of shadow work and the individuation process, I am struck by the profound moral responsibility that accompanies psychological awareness. The individual who gains genuine insight into the workings of his own psyche cannot claim innocence regarding his impact upon others and upon the collective psychological atmosphere in which we all participate. The ethical responsibility that comes with shadow awareness extends far beyond personal psychological health. When we become conscious of our own capacity for projection, manipulation, and unconscious influence upon others, we bear the obligation to exercise this awareness responsibly. The person who understands psychological dynamics but uses this knowledge to manipulate others for personal gain violates the fundamental purpose of psychological development. I have observed that genuine psychological development naturally leads toward service, not from moral compulsion, but from the recognition that individual wholeness contributes to collective health. The person who has achieved some measure of integration naturally becomes a source of stability and wisdom for others, not through preaching or teaching, but simply through being what he has become. The relationship between individual wholeness and cultural renewal represents perhaps the most significant challenge facing our modern world. We live in an age of unprecedented psychological fragmentation, where traditional structures of meaning have weakened without being replaced by adequate alternatives. In such times, the individual who undertakes genuine psychological work contributes to the collective healing that our culture desperately needs. Yet, this contribution cannot be forced or artificially directed. The attempt to use psychological development for social or political purposes inevitably corrupts the process itself. Genuine individuation serves life spontaneously and naturally, without the need for conscious direction toward collective goals. The integrated individual becomes a healing presence in the world, not through effort, but through the natural emanation of psychological wholeness. The ultimate purpose of psychological development lies not in personal gratification or even in individual salvation, but in the service of life itself. The psyche develops consciousness not for its own sake, but to serve the larger purposes of existence. We are called to consciousness not as an end in itself, but as our contribution to the ongoing evolution of life and meaning. My hope for future generations undertaking this work lies in their recognition that psychological development represents both a privilege and a responsibility. Those who are granted the opportunity for enhanced awareness bear the obligation to use this gift wisely, in service of life rather than in service of the ego. The shadow work of which I speak is not undertaken for personal advantage, but for the healing of the world. At the same time, I harbor deep concerns about the trivialization of this most sacred work. The tendency to reduce profound psychological processes to techniques and methods, to promise transformation without genuine suffering, to offer shortcuts to wholeness. These represent dangerous distortions that serve the ego's desire for rapid gratification rather than the soul's need for authentic development. The path of individuation remains as it has always been, a narrow way requiring courage, patience, and genuine dedication to truth. It cannot be traveled quickly or easily, nor can its demands be softened through artificial methods. Those who undertake this journey must be prepared for the long voyage, the dark nights, and the gradual dawn of enhanced awareness. In closing, I would emphasize that the work of which I speak, the careful, gradual integration of shadow content within the larger process of individuation, represents not a luxury for the psychologically sophisticated, but a necessity for anyone who would live a fully human life. We cannot avoid the shadow by ignoring it. We can only choose whether to meet it consciously or to be possessed by it unconsciously. The choice is ours, and the consequences of our choice extend far beyond our individual lives to touch all those whose paths cross ours. In undertaking this most demanding of human tasks, we serve not only ourselves, but life itself, contributing our small part to the great work of healing that our wounded world so desperately needs.